The snow had been falling since before dawn. Not the soft, picturesque kind that decorates Christmas cards. This was the heavy, exhausted kind. The kind that settles into the creases of your coat and stays there. The kind that turns the world gray and muffles everything until silence feels physical. By 6:15 in the morning, Cedar Falls, Colorado had disappeared beneath it. The gas station on Route 9 was a smear of orange light in the white. The water tower had become a ghost. The mountains to the west, which on clear days looked close enough to touch, were gone entirely. The Blue Spruce Diner had been on the corner of Route 9 and Millard Street for 41 years. The sign out front had lost one of its fluorescent tubes sometime in October, so it read BLU Spruck DIR in the pre-dawn darkness, which the regulars found either charming or depressing depending on their disposition. The booths were original red vinyl, cracked at the corners, repaired with electrical tape that had been there so long it looked intentional. The coffee was strong and cheap. The pie was excellent. The heat came from a radiator in the back that knocked and hissed like it was arguing with itself. Michael Carter had been working the morning shift for 3 years. He arrived at 5:45 every day without variation. Parked his 2009 Ford pickup in the side lot, scraped ice off the windshield before he went in, rather than after a habit that made no practical sense, but that he maintained because it was the kind of small, pointless discipline he'd built his days around since his wife left. He made the first pot of coffee, restocked the napkin dispensers, wiped down the counter even though the overnight crew had already done it. And by 6 o'clock, he was in position. A lean, quiet man of 34, brown hair threaded with a little early gray at the temples, an apron tied at the waist. A order pad in his back pocket he almost never used because he'd memorized what everyone wanted. He had a daughter named Cora. She was 7. She stayed at his mother's house on Maple Street on the mornings he worked, which was every morning. And he picked her up by 2:30 so she could be home before 3. This was the shape of his life. Early mornings, the smell of coffee and bacon grease, the drive to his mother's. Cora's voice rising to meet him at the door. Dinner at 6. Homework. Bath. Bedtime. There was not much room for anything else. And he had stopped minding. The regulars came in one by one as the snow fell outside. Old Dale Hutchins, who sat at the same stool and ordered the same eggs, scrambled dry with wheat toast, and then complained they were too dry. The 2 county road workers, who always came in together and never spoke to each other. Patricia Voss, the high school librarian, who brought a book and actually read it, which Michael respected. By 7:15, the diner held its usual quiet Wednesday morning population, and the snow outside had thickened to the point where the windows were nearly opaque. He almost didn't notice her come in. She pushed the door open slowly, like someone who wasn't sure they were allowed, and stood in the entrance for a moment with snow on her shoulders and in her hair. She was young, late 20s, maybe with the kind of pallor that isn't a complexion but a condition. Her coat was a dark wool peacoat that had been good quality once, and now showed the wear of too many seasons and not enough care. She carried a backpack on one shoulder, held against her side like she was guarding it. Her eyes moved around the diner in the careful, measuring way of someone who has learned to calculate how welcome they are before committing to a space. She chose the stool at the far end of the counter, away from everyone, and sat down with her backpack on her lap. She did not pick up the laminated menu. She sat very still and looked at the counter and said nothing. Michael watched her for about 40 seconds while he refilled Dale Hutchins' coffee without looking at the cup. He'd learned, over 3 years at the Blue Spruce, to read the people who came in. Most customers were uncomplicated, hungry, cold, in a hurry, or not. But occasionally someone came through the door carrying something heavier than weather, and this woman was one of them. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself slightly away from the counter, as though she hadn't yet decided she deserved to be there. He could see it in the way she was not looking at the menu. He poured a mug of coffee, carried it to the far end of the counter, and set it in front of her without a word. She looked up. Her eyes were blue and very tired. "I haven't ordered anything," she said. "It's just coffee," he said. "On the house." She looked at the mug for a moment, then wrapped both hands around it and held it the way you hold something warm when you've been cold for a very long time. He went back to his station, She drank the coffee in careful sips, looking at the counter. Outside, the snow kept falling. Dale Hutchins finished his eggs and complained about them and left. The two road workers got up and pulled on their coats and went out into the white. Patricia Voss turned a page. Michael Carter went to the window behind the counter and looked at the specials board, and then he did something he did not often do. He made a decision about someone else's situation without being asked to. He put in an order for 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, home fries, and a short stack. He plated it himself. He carried it to the end of the counter and set it down in front of the woman without ceremony. The way you'd set down something that belonged there. She stared at it. "I didn't order this," she said again. Her voice was careful. The way people speak when they are trying not to sound like they are about to cry. "I know," he said. "I can't pay for it." "I know," he said again. She looked at him, then really looked. The kind of look that is trying to understand the angle, the catch, the thing being asked in return. She had been in the world long enough to know that things were rarely given without a price, and her wariness was not rude. It was earned. He held her gaze without flinching, without smiling too hard, without the apologetic overwarmth that sometimes accompanies charity and makes it feel worse than nothing. "Eat," he said. "It's getting cold." She ate. She ate slowly, with the particular care of someone who has not had a real meal in a while and knows it, the careful, deliberate quality of someone who is trying not to appear ravenous while being ravenous. Michael turned away and gave her privacy, which was the more important gift. When the plate was mostly empty, he refilled her coffee without asking. She reached into the outer pocket of her backpack and pulled out a small fold of bills, a 5 and 3 ones, and some change. She laid them on the counter with her palm flat on top of them. "I want to pay," she said. "Whatever I can." He looked at the money. He looked at her. Then he slid the bills back toward her, gently, and she felt the small pressure of his fingers against the back of her hand as he did it. "Keep it," he said. "I have to pay you back somehow," she said. Her jaw was set. Pride was still functioning, still fighting. When I get back on my feet, I'll come back. I'll pay you back." He was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee pot in his hand once. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not pity and not kindness. Exactly, it was something more specific than either of those. Something closer to recognition. "Pay me when you're the boss," he said. He said it the way you'd say, "It'll stop raining by afternoon," not a promise. Not a dare. An assumption. A fact that hadn't arrived yet. She blinked. "What?" But he'd already moved down the counter to refill Patricia Voss's tea. And he didn't elaborate. And something about the way he said it, the complete absence of irony, the total lack of sentiment, made it land differently than encouragement would have. It wasn't, "I believe in you." It wasn't, "You've got this." It was something quieter and harder and more absolute. An assumption that her future was a given. That the only question was when. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled on her coat, picked up her backpack, and walked back out into the snow. The cold hit her immediately. She had a car, a 2007 Honda Civic with one working rear defroster, parked 2 blocks east, and she walked toward it with her chin tucked into her collar and snow collecting on her eyelashes. The town was quiet. The storefronts on Millard Street were dark at this hour, their windows sheeted with ice. She played the words back in her head without meaning to. "Pay me when you're the boss." Not if, not maybe someday. When. She didn't know his name. She'd barely looked at his face. He was a man in an apron in a diner, in a town she'd stopped in, because her car needed gas and her body needed warmth, and she'd had $8 to her name and no plan for breakfast. That was the whole of what she knew about him. And yet, she sat in her car for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the snow accumulate on the windshield until the world outside disappeared, and all she could see was white. She thought about the way he'd slid the money back, not dismissively, carefully, as though the bills themselves deserved respect even if the debt didn't need to be paid. She thought about the tone of his voice, which had carried no pity in it at all. Pity she could have withstood. Pity was familiar. What she hadn't been prepared for was being treated like someone who was between points on a journey, rather than someone who had arrived at the end of one. When you're the boss, she started the engine and pulled out of the spot and drove south on Route 9, and the words came with her. They would stay with her for a long time. Longer than she could have predicted, sitting in that diner at 7:30 on a February morning, the way certain sentences do not because they are poetic or profound, but because they arrive at the exact moment when the ground beneath you is uncertain and something in them suggests, without argument, that the ground is going to hold. She didn't believe it yet. That was the honest truth. She was too depleted, too recent in her failure, too steeped in the evidence against herself to simply believe it. But she carried it anyway, the way you carry a match in your pocket when you're not sure there will be anywhere to light it. Her name was Emily Dawson, and 3 years before she'd walked into the Blue Spruce Diner, she had been someone who got mentioned in industry publications. She'd founded her company at 25, in the particular window of life when intelligence and audacity operate without the friction of experience. The company, a logistics software platform called Vantage Systems, had been built on a genuine insight about supply chain inefficiencies in mid-market retail. It was not a stupid idea. That was important to understand later when she tried to make sense of what happened. It was not a stupid idea. The idea had been real. What had not been real was her understanding of how quickly the gap between a good idea and a functioning company could destroy a person. She'd raised a seed round at 26 from a venture firm in Denver, $800,000, which had felt enormous and turned out to be barely enough to hire 3 engineers and rent office space for 18 months. The product took longer to build than the roadmap said it would, which is the first sentence in the story of almost every startup that doesn't make it. The engineers were good, the market was real, but the burn rate exceeded the revenue by a margin that grew rather than shrank. And the bridge financing she'd counted on to carry them to Series A didn't materialize, and by the time she understood that the firm that had funded her seed round was not going to follow on, it was too late to cut costs in any way that would have mattered. The company closed on a Tuesday in November. She laid off 5 people that afternoon, sat in the empty office until 9 o'clock that night, and drove home in the first snowfall of the season. What followed was not dramatic. There were no headlines, no public postmortems. She had not been famous enough for failure to be public. She simply disappeared from the spaces where she'd existed, and the industry moved on the way it always does, already absorbed in the next thing. She spent 4 months paying off debts with the remnants of her personal savings and a loan from her parents that she promised herself she'd repay before she would accept any other help. She worked a string of contract jobs, data analysis work, mostly for companies that needed someone who understood logistics systems. She moved from her apartment in Denver to a cheaper place in a town she didn't know because the rent was $300 less per month. She stopped reaching out to the network she'd built, partly because the conversations felt excruciating, and partly because she'd begun to wonder if she was the kind of person other people in that world wanted to know. She started to believe, without ever stating it clearly to herself, that the failure had been a verdict, not just about the company about her. That Vantage Systems hadn't simply been a startup that didn't work out. It had been a test she had failed, and the result was a reliable indicator of what she was capable of. This belief settled into her quietly, the way assumptions do when they go unexamined, and it changed the way she moved through her days. She started making smaller plans. She stopped writing anything down. She began to regard ambition as a symptom of naivety, rather than a quality worth maintaining. By the time she walked into the Blue Spruce Diner, she was 28 years old and had not written a business plan in 14 months. She had told herself she was being realistic. The months after Cedar Falls were not a turning point. Not immediately. She drove south to a town called Durango and picked up a 3-month consulting contract with a mid-size manufacturing company that needed their inventory systems reviewed. She was good at the work. She was professional and thorough, and her clients were satisfied. And she told herself this was enough. To be useful, reliable, adequate. To ask for no more than what the day required. She found an apartment on the 2nd floor of a building, run by a landlord named Garrett, who fixed things when they broke and asked no questions, and occasionally left a loaf of bread outside her door in winter without explanation. She bought a space heater. She learned which grocery store marked down its produce on Thursday evenings. She built a life that was small and functional and required very little from her. At night, sometimes, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open to a blank document and a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she thought about the diner. She thought about the man with the coffee pot and the steady hands and the absence of pity in his face. She thought about the way he'd said "when you're the boss," not as a wish for her, but as a fact about her, stated in the same neutral, certain tone you'd use to say the sun comes up in the east. She replayed the moment the way you replay a song you heard once in a place you can't go back to. Not because you'd choose to live there, but because something in it is still working on you. She understood, eventually, what had struck her. It wasn't the generosity. She'd received generosity before, from her parents, from friends who'd checked in after the company closed, from the investor who'd written her a kind note, saying it had been a good idea and the timing had been wrong. That had all been warm and well-intentioned, and had felt, if she was honest, like condolence. Like being helped into a chair after a loss. What the man at the diner had offered was something different. He had not treated the food as charity. He had not treated her as someone who needed rescuing. He had treated her as someone who was not yet where she was going, which is a completely different thing. Charity says, "You are down, let me help you." What he'd said was closer to your between places. Keep moving. He had not seen her failure. He had seen her trajectory. She sat at the kitchen table in Durango on a February night, exactly 1 year after Cedar Falls, with a cup of cold tea and a blank document. And she thought, I don't want to be the person who proved him wrong. It was not a revelation. It was not a surge of confidence. It was smaller than that, more like a refusal than a decision. A quiet and unremarkable refusal to let the assumption of a stranger in an apron turn out to have been mistaken. She opened a new document and started writing. The idea was not Vantage Systems. She understood, clearly, that going back to the same well would be a different kind of failure than the first, not brave, just stubborn. She had learned things in the collapse of her company that she'd only half understood while building it, the way you only learn the layout of a room once the lights go out. She knew where the load-bearing walls were now. She knew what she'd overlooked. The new idea was narrower. Where Vantage had tried to be a comprehensive platform for mid-market retail logistics, this new concept was a single, specific tool: real-time freight exception management for regional distributors. The companies that couldn't afford the enterprise solutions but were losing 10 to 15% of their margins to delayed shipment exceptions they caught too late. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of idea that got written up in publications. It was the kind of idea that solved a specific and painful problem for a specific and underserved market, and that was the only criterion she applied. She spent 3 months building the pitch before she showed it to anyone. She was rigorous in a way she hadn't been the first time, when enthusiasm had sometimes substituted for rigor. She talked to 23 regional distributors over the phone, introduced through a cold outreach campaign so unpolished it was almost charming in its directness. She asked them about their exception management processes. She asked what it cost them. She asked what they'd pay to fix it. She turned their answers into a model. And the model told her the market was real. And the real question was whether she could build the product cheaply enough to reach it. She could not get the product built cheaply enough on her own. She needed capital. She began the process of asking for it again, which was the hardest thing she'd done since the day she laid off 5 people in a Denver office in November. The first 12 pitches produced 12 rejections. Not cruel ones. The venture world had grown somewhat less cruel about rejection in recent years. Or perhaps she was better at absorbing it now, but rejections nonetheless. Too small, too narrow, too early, too late, not the right fit. She took notes on every conversation, and she did not take the rejections personally. Or rather, she felt each one the way you feel a physical impact, a brief and genuine pain, but she did not let the feeling make decisions for her. This was new. This was something she'd learned. She kept going. Her name was Sophia Bennett, and she ran a small, disciplined fund in Boulder called Arbor Capital that focused on vertical SaaS for industrial markets. Emily had found her through the founder of a freight brokerage in Fort Collins, who'd heard Emily's pitch at a regional tech event and called her the next week to say, "I don't invest, but I know someone who might." The introduction was warm and specific, and Sophia responded to the email within 48 hours, which in Emily's experience was a favorable sign. They met 3 times over 6 weeks. Sophia was methodical, which Emily respected, and asked the kind of questions that revealed she'd actually read the materials rather than glanced at them. She pushed back on the pricing model. She asked about customer acquisition cost and didn't accept the first answer. She wanted to know about the failed company, not as a disqualification, but as a data set. What had Emily learned? What would she do differently? What remained from that experience that was now an asset? Emily answered honestly, that was all she could do. After the 3rd meeting, Sophia sat back in her chair and looked at Emily for a moment, with the particular expression of someone who has finished deciding and is checking the decision one more time before stating it. The first company failed for reasons that are mostly mechanical, Sophia said. Burn rate, runway, timing on the bridge. Those are solvable problems if you know they're coming. You know they're coming now. Yes, Emily said. The product idea is good. The market is undersized compared to what I usually look at. But the margin profile is strong if you hit your unit economics targets. I think we can. Sophia looked at her for another moment. I'm going to lead the seed round, she said. I want to be at the table for this one. The round was $650,000. Smaller than Vantage's seed, which was intentional. Emily had built the model to get to revenue faster and on less capital, and the constraint felt like discipline rather than limitation. She hired 2 engineers, one of whom she'd worked with before and trusted completely. She took a below-market salary for herself and put it in the board minutes so there was no ambiguity. The company was called Trackline. It launched its beta to 11 customers in October. The first 18 months were not easy. There was a period in the second quarter when 3 customer contracts came up for renewal simultaneously, and 2 of them were uncertain, and Emily slept very little for about 3 weeks and held the thing together by force of will and meticulous attention to what each customer actually needed. One of the uncertain contracts renewed. The other didn't. She took the loss, analyzed it without self-pity, and used it to revise her customer success process. The company grew, not explosively, deliberately. By the end of the 2nd year, Trackline had 28 paying customers, a net revenue retention rate that Sophia called the best number in your deck, and a team of 6. Emily was running on something different than she'd run on at Vantage, which had been partly enthusiasm and partly fear. This was quieter, more like conviction, which is enthusiasm with the naivety removed. She was 31 years old and she was building something real. In the 3rd year of Trackline, a customer, a regional distributor in Kansas, with 32 locations, filed a contract dispute, claiming that the platform had provided inaccurate exception data that led to a costly carrier penalty. The claim was for $180,000 in damages. Emily's initial read of the technical logs was that the claim was not supported by the data. The exception flags had been accurate. The carrier penalty had resulted from a decision made by the customer's operations team that ignored the flags. But the customer had documentation, and they had a lawyer, and the dispute landed in Emily's inbox on a Thursday morning in March, with a letter that made her stomach drop in a way she recognized from the worst days at Vantage. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop, walked to the window of her office, and stood there looking at the parking lot for about 3 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and started working. She spent 4 days with her engineering team reconstructing every event in the timeline, every data point the platform had generated, every logged interaction from the customer's user accounts. She hired a lawyer, a sharp, economical woman named Claire Abrams, who specialized in SaaS contract disputes, and who told Emily on their first call that the case was winnable and that winning it would take between 4 and 6 weeks and cost somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in legal fees. Emily asked her to proceed. She did not tell the team how worried she was. She told them what they needed to know. There was a dispute. They were addressing it. Their job was to document everything thoroughly and accurately, and then continue building. That was what she'd learned about leadership by now, that fear, communicated downward through an organization, multiplied. The job of the person at the top was to absorb it. She ran the dispute process and the company at the same time for 5 weeks. There were evenings when she sat alone at her desk after everyone else had left and felt the specific exhaustion of holding 2 heavy things simultaneously. She did not catastrophize, at least not out loud. In her notebook, privately, she wrote down the worst-case scenarios so they couldn't ambush her. The case goes badly. They pay the $180,000. The company survives, but the runway compresses. They need to grow faster. She worked through each scenario calmly in writing, and then she closed the notebook. Claire Abrams resolved the dispute on a Wednesday in April, 3 weeks ahead of the high end of her estimate. The customer withdrew the claim. Final legal cost: $47,000. Emily sent the team an email at 9 o'clock that evening. It said, "Dispute resolved. We're clear. See you all tomorrow." She drove home and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. She was not exhilarated. She was tired in the way you're tired, after carrying something far and setting it down, not the pleasant tiredness of exercise, but the bone-deep relief of release. She thought, for the first time in months, about the Blue Spruce Diner. She thought about a man in an apron who had handed her a plate of food on a February morning without asking anything in return, and had told her to pay him back when she was the boss. She was the boss now. She pulled out her phone and searched the name of the town where she'd stopped for gas 5 years ago. Cedar Falls, Colorado. She searched for the diner. There was a basic listing. No website. Still operating. Same address. She put her phone in her pocket and went inside. She waited until February, because it felt right. The limousine had been Sophia's idea, half joking, at a team dinner 2 months earlier. "When are you going to go back and pay the guy back?" And Emily had laughed and said she didn't need a limo for that. But then she thought about it more carefully and decided that the gesture wasn't about ostentation. It was about honoring the weight of the moment, which deserved more than a Subaru. She booked the car for a Tuesday morning, which was a slow day for most diners, because she wanted him to have time to talk. The drive north from Denver to Cedar Falls took just under 3 hours. She sat in the back of the car with a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains emerging through the gray morning sky and thought about what she was going to say. She'd written some of it down, the way she wrote everything down, and then she'd put the notepad away because she understood that prepared words were the wrong instrument for this particular moment. It was snowing when the car turned onto Millard Street. Of course it was. The Blue Spruce Diner looked almost exactly the same. The sign had been repaired it now. Read the full name in working letters, but the building was unchanged. The same weathered clapboard, the same steam-fogged windows, the same quality of warmth visible from outside that looks more precious in cold weather. She sat in the car for a moment looking at it. Then she told the driver she'd be an hour, maybe less, and she got out. The bell above the door rang when she pushed it open. The diner was quiet. 2 men in work coats at a booth near the window. A woman with a paperback at the counter. The small sounds of a kitchen operating steadily behind the order window. The smell was exactly what she remembered. Coffee and toast and something buttery. He was behind the counter. He looked up when the door opened. The automatic look of a person in service. And then he registered something in her face that made him look again. He was older than she remembered. The gray at his temples had spread, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there, but the quality of his stillness was the same. He was a man who did not react before he understood. She walked to the far end of the counter. The same stool. She sat down. He came to her end of the counter and stood across from her, unhurried, and they looked at each other for a moment, with the particular recognition of people who shared a single brief encounter years ago that turned out to matter more than most long ones. "Coffee?" he said. "Please," she said. He poured it. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "You were here," he said. It was not a question. "About 5 years ago," she said. "February." It was snowing. "It was always snowing in February," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. She looked at the coffee mug. She had prepared to speak, and now speaking felt insufficient, because there was no efficient way to compress 5 years of someone's life into the space between 2 people at a diner counter and she didn't want to be efficient about it anyway. She wanted to get it right. I was in bad shape, she said. I'd lost my company. I had $8. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. He nodded once. You fed me. You wouldn't take my money. She paused. You said something. I remember, he said quietly. She looked up at him. It's the thing I've thought about more than almost anything else in the last 5 years. Not because it fixed me, it didn't. I was still a mess when I walked out of here. I was still scared. I still didn't know what I was going to do. She stopped. But you said when, not if. You didn't say it like you were trying to make me feel better. You said it like you already knew. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter. I didn't know anything about you, he said. I just know what people look like when they're between things. He considered this. You looked like someone who was between things. Not someone who was done. She held the coffee mug with both hands. I started over, she said. The second company. It's called Trackline. We do freight exception management for regional distributors. She paused. I know that sounds incredibly boring. Does it work? He said. Yes, she said. It works. Then it's not boring, he said. She almost smiled. She reached into her coat and took out a plain white envelope and placed it on the counter between them. She didn't push it toward him. I want to pay for the breakfast, she said. With interest. That's in there. She met his eyes. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't I'm not here to do something for you because I feel like I owe you. I mean I do, but that's not the only reason I'm here. She looked at the envelope. I've thought for a long time about what it means to actually repay someone for something like that, and I don't think it's just money. He didn't touch the envelope. He was listening. I found out you have a daughter, she said. I didn't hire anyone to investigate you. I just asked around town a little when I was planning this. Her name is Cora. She's 12 now. She paused. I don't know your situation. I don't know if you're happy here. I don't know if this, she gestured, carefully, at the diner around them is exactly what you want your life to look like, or if it's what you've built because it was available. He was very still. If there's something you want, she said, and there's a way I can help, not by giving you something, but by opening a door, making an introduction, creating an option, I'd like to do that. I'm not assuming you need anything from me. I'm asking. She stopped. What do you actually want? Not for your daughter, not for anyone else. What do you want? The diner was quiet around them. Snow fell past the windows. Michael Carter looked at the counter for a long moment. Then he looked at the woman across from him. This person who had walked in 5 years ago, hollow-eyed and hungry, and was sitting here now with a car waiting outside, and a stillness in her that was different from the stillness he'd seen in her before. The first stillness had been the stillness of someone who had run out of momentum. This was the stillness of someone who had found a center. He picked up the coffee pot and turned it in his hands once, the way he always did when he was thinking. My daughter wants to study environmental science, he said. She's good at it. I mean actually good. Her teacher called me last month. Emily waited. I've been putting money aside, he said. It's slow. The math is, it's tight. He set the coffee pot down. I don't want her to start with debt if she doesn't have to. Emily nodded once. She didn't say anything. I'm not asking you for, he started. I know, she said. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an option. She met his eyes. There's a scholarship fund I'm involved with through my company. It's for first-generation college students in STEM. It covers tuition and housing for 4 years. Your daughter would need to apply like everyone else, compete on her merits. She paused. But if she's as good as you say, she should know the door exists. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. I'll tell her. She slid a business card across the counter to him. He picked it up and looked at it and put it in his apron pocket. She took the envelope and set it closer to him. The breakfast, she said. Plus 5 years of interest. He looked at the envelope. You didn't need to do that. I know, she said. I wanted to. He left the envelope on the counter. She finished her coffee. She pulled on her coat and picked up her bag and looked at him one last time. "Thank you," she said. "For what you did. And for the way you did it." He nodded. "Good luck with the boring freight stuff," he said. She did smile then. Briefly, fully, and it changed her face entirely. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and the bell rang above it, and she stepped out into the snow. The car was waiting where she'd left it. She got in without looking back at the diner, which was not because she didn't want to look back, she did, but because some moments are better carried forward than turned over. She'd said what she'd come to say. She'd given what she'd come to give. The rest belonged to him now. The same way the breakfast had once belonged to her. The driver asked if she was ready to head back to Denver. She said yes. The car pulled out onto Millard Street and turned south onto Route 9. And the Blue Spruce Diner disappeared behind the snowfall in the rearview mirror, and Emily Dawson sat in the warmth of the car and looked out the window at the white mountains emerging through the clouds. She thought about Cora, a 12-year-old she'd never met who was apparently good at environmental science, and who had, without knowing it, been sitting at the center of her father's quiet daily arithmetic for years. Tuition cost subtracted from income, stretched across time, managed with the same steady competence he applied to everything. She thought about the kind of person who builds a life like that not with bitterness, not with resentment, just with care. Who shows up at 5:45 in the morning and does the work because the work is what keeps things whole. She thought about what she'd said. "I'm not here because I feel like I owe you." That had been true. It had also been incomplete, the way most true things are. She did owe him something, but the debt was not financial. The debt was the kind that can't be repaid directly, only passed on. The only honest way to repay someone who gives you a direction is to eventually offer direction to someone else, and to do it without making it about yourself. The man at the diner had done something for her that 5 years of striving had not fully paid back, and would not fully pay back. And that was all right. Some debts are supposed to stay a little open. They're the ones that keep you honest. Behind her, on Millard Street, Michael Carter pocketed the business card and went back to work. He had 3 tables to turn. The breakfast rush, such as it was on a Tuesday morning in February, would be winding down within the hour. He had to be at his mother's house by 2:30 to pick up Cora from her after-school robotics club. And then they were going to the grocery store. And then home. And then dinner. And then her science homework, which this week involved something about carbon sequestration that he'd been honest with her about not fully understanding, and she'd been patient in explaining it to him, which he found quietly extraordinary. He did not think of himself as someone who had done anything particularly significant. He had fed a stranger once, the way he had fed other strangers on other mornings, because it was the right thing, and he'd had the capacity. He had said something true because it was what the moment required. He had not thought about it much afterward, which was perhaps why the memory of it had remained clean, unencumbered by any self-congratulation, any narrative of his own virtue. But he thought about it now, briefly, as he cleared a table near the window and watched the snow fall on Route 9. He thought about the way she'd looked sitting at that stool, not triumphant, not performing anything for him, just there, with her hands around the coffee mug, and something settled in her face that hadn't been there before. The kind of settlement that takes years to build, the kind that shows in the way a person inhabits a room. He thought about what she'd said. "You said it like you already knew." He hadn't known anything. He'd had a feeling that was not hope. Exactly more like perception, the same perception that told him 20 times a day at this counter what someone needed before they asked. Sometimes it was just coffee. Sometimes it was space. Sometimes, rarely, it was the thing under the thing, the affirmation that the version of themselves that existed in the future was not hypothetical, but actual. Not something to be earned, but something to be arrived at. He put the card with her phone number in his apron pocket. He'd tell Cora about it tonight, after dinner, when the kitchen was clean and she was doing her homework at the table. And he'd tell her carefully, not dramatically, not as a rescue narrative, but as a fact. There is a scholarship. Your teacher says you're good. Here is a door. It was up to her to walk through it or not. That was always how it worked. He poured coffee for the couple in the corner booth, asked them if they needed anything else, and received the small reflexive thanks that passes between strangers and means